My abusive grandmother made sure that I stayed fat so she could make fun of me for being fat. My mother passed away when I was a year and a half old. From then on till I was around 11, my care was entrusted entirely to my grandmother. That vile tramp knew she had power over a defenseless little girl and decided to abuse the hell out of it for her own amusement. My dad at the time was going through some legal and financial struggles. He married my stepmother when I was 4, but my grandmother wouldn't let her cook for me. She threw tantrums and begged my dad to let her remain in charge of every aspect of my life. We are Indians, and in our culture, it is customary for elderly parents to stay with their adult children, so there was no escape for me. My stepmom would cook for my dad, stepbrother, and herself, and my grandmother would cook for herself and for me. The food she made for me on a daily basis is something no responsible caregiver would allow their child to consume regularly. She cooked deep-fried, fatty foods, along with overly sweetened desserts. I hardly ever got to eat fresh veggies or fruits. For my school lunch, she gave me the same. On more than one occasion, my teachers expressed concern over what I was eating. When my dad brought this up with her, she would put on an Oscar-worthy performance and would cry about how I was her baby girl, how she was doing the best she could, and how dare my father suggest that she wanted anything less than the best for me. My dad, at the time, was pretty spineless, so he decided to let her do as she pleased in order to maintain peace in our home. As expected, I began to balloon up. By the time I was 8, I was already morbidly obese for my age. I couldn't run without running out of breath after a short distance. As I wasn't getting the required nutrients, only fried junk, I was also anemic. I looked huge, but was actually quite weak. And of course, with my obesity came the ruthless bullying from my peers. I had no friends, and bullies found me irresistible. My self-esteem was so low as it could be. I also had a stutter at the time, so you can imagine how much fun school must have been. My grandmother, of course, placed the entire blame on me. She told almost every day that I was fat and disgusting as a freak, that my stutter was a punishment from God, that I would never have friends, along with many other horrible things that one can say to break a child. My dad never intervened. His marriage to my stepmom was suffering. Grandma made a huge contribution to that mess too, by the way. For about a year, my stepmom actually took my stepbrother and moved back in with her parents. Can't say I blame her. As I got older, I got fatter and angrier. At age 13, I was a ball of rage on legs. I began to realize what my grandmother had done to me. I knew what she had been stuffing me with for years was what made me obese. I had now taken to hitting her when she would mock me. I would punch her, kick her, and even drop constant reminders that her husband had left her for her sister. She would bawl about how cruel I was, and I'd get punished. I began to refuse the food that she would cook, and thus would cause her to bawl some more. My dad too began to realize that my health would deteriorate to the point of no return if I kept consuming my grandmother's slow poison. He always reprimanded me very strictly for my violent outbursts, but he did support my efforts to live a healthier lifestyle. However, losing all that weight was no easy task. I struggled for years, and finally, as I entered my early 20s, I was at a normal weight. Today I am superbly fit. I run, I practice yoga and Kala'ipayattu, an ancient Indian form of martial arts. I can honestly say that I am in love with my body. My grandmother too suffered the consequences of her poor diet. She became diabetic and in her old age was almost entirely bedridden. And we're going to find that out on the next post. Our next story was posted by user ShyGirl-Turned-Sassy, titled, "Raising kids, just so you can use them in your old age, is probably the most selfish thing you can do." My grandmother was, and remains to this day, the most evil human being I have ever met. She was manipulative, emotionally, and even physically abusive, and believed wholeheartedly that she was entitled to our care. Here are the things she did to deserve being labeled as such. When my dad was around 10 and his sister 13, my grandfather left my grandmother for her sister. This was no doubt a great blow to all three of them. However, instead of protecting her children and caring for them the best of her abilities, she began to systematically brainwash my dad to convince him that the most important thing in his life was to look after his mother and sister. My aunt, Dad's sister, DS, I've made a post about her as well, has somehow convinced her that she needed to keep her son under her control in order to secure her future. We live in India, and here it is expected of sons to care for their parents in their old age. So, apart from societal expectations, my dad was also pressured by his mother's emotional blackmail. When Dad fell in love with my mum, GM did everything she could to sabotage their relationship. She would constantly try to create misunderstandings between them, going as far as to tell my mum that Dad was cheating on her with several other women. But somehow their relationship survived, and they got married. When Mum was pregnant with me, GM and DS would verbally and physically assault my mum. Mum never told Dad, and he only found out about it years later after she had passed away. No, they didn't kill her. When my dad married my stepmom and she and my stepbrother moved in, she was cruel to them as well. She once told my dad to get my stepbrother out of the house because that boy is going to take advantage of your daughter when he grows up. My stepbrother must have been around 9 at that time. The way she taunted and gaslighted me led to me developing self-esteem and trust issues. When I was in the 2nd grade, my best friend was a boy. Every day, we walked to school together holding hands. She saw this and called she a tramp who would bring shame upon our family by going around with boys. She said this in front of some of our neighbors. A couple of them were just as misogynistic as her and snickered as I teared up. I was so embarrassed and mortified that I stopped talking to the boy. It broke my 7-year-old heart. Grandma was addicted to sweets and fried foods. At age 60, she became diabetic, but refused to follow any kind of diet. In a few years, she became almost completely bedridden. Her pancreas had stopped making insulin. She needed regular insulin injections and needed assistance in going to the bathroom. I was 14 at the time my family was struggling financially. Both my parents worked full-time, and we could only afford a part-time nurse. So every day after I came home from school, the nurse would leave and I would take her place. I would help her eat, help her go to the bathroom, and give her the injections. The whole time I was either studying or attending to her. As a result, I had no social life and had trouble keeping friends. Was she ever grateful? Hell no! Nothing I or my parents ever did was ever good enough for her. Every night when my dad came home from work, she would always have a few complaints about me. My dad hardly ever listened to my side of the story, and she would just tell me that I needed to respect my grandmother. That tramp would smirk as my dad reprimanded me. Given the amount of suppressed rage I carried within me, it is truly amazing that I did not commit some kind of a violent crime. When I was 17, DS had come over for a visit. The conversation was somehow diverted to the topic of marriage and kids. I told them offhandedly that I didn't want kids. DS looked horrified and told me that I was insane. Grandma took it several notches higher and told me that she would make sure that my dad would marry me off to a guy who would take advantage of me to get me pregnant and would beat me every night. I haven't felt anger like that before or since. I was chopping vegetables for dinner and I remember clutching the knife even tighter and feeling an overwhelming urge to slit her throat and watching her bleed to death. If I kill her right now, I thought, my family would be rid of this monster. Fortunately, I did no such thing, as I knew that she was not worth going to prison. I walked away to calm myself down. In 2008, on this day, the 2nd of September, she finally died. The horror story finally came to an end. And today, at 34, I have a successful career, my own penthouse apartment, and a loving boyfriend who is also CF. My dad's also doing well. Every time I accomplish something, I feel like I'm slapping my grandmother and telling her to frick off. This post on her 10-year death anniversary is yet another frick you to her. The point of this rant is not to garner sympathy, but simply to emphasize that parents too can be vile, cruel, and abusive to their own children. Simply popping out a few offspring does not make you a better person. Thank you very much for reading. And our next story was also posted by Shy Girl Turned Sassy, titled, My entitled grandmother stole my new clothes and exchanged them for steel utensils, so I gave away her utensils. I'm Indian, and in my country, till a few years ago, you could get steel utensils from door-to-door vendors in exchange for clothes. This barter system still exists in villages and some small towns. My grandmother, being the insane hoarder that she was, loved getting utensils in this manner. Utensils that no one else was allowed to touch, that she would never use, and would only gather dust in her room. Anytime my stepmom or my dad tried to donate our old clothes to charity, that woman would throw a hissy fit. She'd collect all the clothes that we weren't going to wear anymore so she could exchange them for pots and pans. At times, she would take it a step further and demand clothes that we were still going to wear. She would insist that they don't fit us anymore, or some other bullcrap argument to get us to hand them over. Seriously, we had to sometimes fight her to keep our own clothes. Oh, but she never gave away her own clothes. She only took garments from others, namely me, my dad, my stepmom, and my stepbrother. When I was around 21, I had just lost a lot of weight and needed new clothes. Yes, I lived with my parents. In India, you cannot afford to live independently unless you have a well-paying job, and I was in college at the time. So one day I went to a local store's clearance sale and bought a bunch of new threads. I left them on my bed and went off to a friend's place. When I returned home a few hours later, my new clothes were gone. My dad, stepmom, and brother were not home, so I figured out instantly who must have taken them. I confronted the grand monster and asked what she had done with my clothes. She was sitting on her bed, admiring her latest haul of pots and pans. Without even looking up, she told me my clothes were ugly and too westernized, and that she did the right thing by exchanging them for something useful. As you can imagine, I lost my temper. I yelled, cursed at her, called her every name in the book, and she had the audacity to actually defend her actions. That evening, there was a major showdown in our home. I was still livid and asked my dad exactly how long we were going to put up with her abuse. My stepmother and I don't get along, but when one of us was up against Grand Monster, the other always lent her support. This was no different. My stepmother agreed with me wholeheartedly. My dad told Grand Monster that she was now forbidden from entering my room without prior permission. She started to fake cry and said we were all being so cruel to her. My dad later came to my room and said he would make it up to me and buy me new clothes. I, of course, was still livid, and I wasn't about to let that expletive have this victory. My grandmother needed sleeping pills to fall asleep. She took them even during the day, and she slept like the dead. A few days later, I snuck into her room during her afternoon nap. I opened her quote-unquote utensils trunk. Yeah, she had a whole trunk full of them, and took out a whole bunch of her beloved pots, glasses, plates, etc. I shut the lid quietly and exited. I went straight to an old age shelter that was nearby. I donated the utensils and earned the joy of giving and the taste of sweet, sweet revenge. I did not tell anyone what I had done and just waited for the Grand Monster to discover her loss, which she did just a few days later. It happened in the evening. I was in the kitchen cooking dinner when I heard her ear-piercing wails about how someone had stolen her utensils chest. A satisfied smile spread across my face. My dad called me into the grandmother's room and asked if I knew anything about the missing utensils. I admitted that I had taken and donated them. Grand Monster looked like her head would explode. I calmly told her I had done the right thing because those utensils were ugly and that the shelter needed them more. And clearly, if she could come into my room and take my things without asking, I could jolly well do the same. I think my dad was upset with me, but really had nothing to say to me. He spent the next hour or so trying to calm down his mother. I slept so bloody well that night. When my grandmonster died a few years later, the first of her beloved things we got rid of were those frickin' utensils. Our next story was posted by user Unicorn Sponge, titled, "My Mother is Stealing My House." Now, this is very difficult for me to write, but I have to get it out since it has now reached a point where I feel like it's destroyed me. Backstory. My mother has had multiple points of trauma in her life. This includes a family member sexually assaulting her in the worst way at a young age, and her first boyfriend repeating this not so many years after. No one in the family believed either at the time that it happened. I'm hoping it was this and not that they implied it was her fault. After this, she dropped out of school, got pregnant with me in a one-night stand, then experimented with different drugs, the most prominent being meth. After this, more trauma occurred when she got into a very near fatal car crash, sustaining multiple head injuries. This accident happened when I was 10 and I was living with my grandparents. When my grandmother died, I had a big decision my 26-year-old brain had to make. Do I take over the mortgage of her house, or do I let the mortgage lender take possession of it? I knew what my mum wanted, and she didn't hide it well, and I also hated to leave the house I spent a majority of my childhood in the state that my mother and grandmother had left it in. This was the beginning of the end. During the process of refinancing the mortgage, my mother insisted that her name be kept on the deed. Not the mortgage, just the deed. I questioned this, then questioned it again when the new lender I had chosen made a comment that this was unusual, but I shrugged it off. I had more important stuff to worry about, like making the house actually habitable. Unfortunately, something goes wrong with my grandmother's life insurance, and I only get a quarter of what I'm supposed to. This did not happen to my mother, although she did spend a large chunk on funeral expenses. Whatever, I think. I have money in savings. So I force my significant other to come with me, roll up my sleeves, and get to work on the house. There is pet damage in 90% of this house, so new carpets, new linoleum in the kitchen, new paint on every wall, a new well, new fridge, new washing machine, new toilet. Keep in mind, when I say new, I meant bought at thrift or restores as often as possible. I even found a warehouse to buy the carpet discounts and a friend to help teach me how to install it. I repaired electrical outlets, holes in the walls, gutters, and the riding lawnmower that was in the garage. I worked hard to create an environment that I could be proud to call home. Then it happened. When my mum moved into her house, she immediately spent hundreds of dollars on brand new furniture for her dining and living room. I scolded her a bit, telling her how I was paying a fraction of what she was by going to thrift stores. She gave me excuses such as they don't have any in her area, which is 30 minutes away, and how she wanted her house to feel like a home. I just shook my head, and I said that I thought it was a bad move. After her GF moved out, my mum had to get roommates quick, and ended up with one who would scream at her in the middle of the night while she was asleep, waking her up in a terror, and another who would lock her cat outside at night in the winter. While still grieving the loss of my grandmother, she kicked them out. Now, however, she can't afford her mortgage, and so I start paying our cell phone bill. I'm a little miffed because this means I'll be paying off a phone that was supposed to be my Christmas present. My mum did one of those free with a 2-year contract and blah, money sign a month. For some reason, a bill that begins at $100 a month quickly grows to $250. I eventually get the information to access the account online, and I find out that she's added a third line for a friend who needed a phone. I asked why she didn't give me a heads up, let alone ask since she's the one paying for now. She responded with a simple, "Sorry, I forgot," because I wasn't an authorized user. I couldn't remove the third line, and my mum continued to forget until I just stopped paying the bill. Time passes, and she starts asking me for grocery money. The first time, I give her a small sum and tell her she needs to get a better job. She doesn't want to because she's working at a university and will get a discount there if she ever decided to go back to school. Coming from someone who, remember, didn't even finish high school. She continues to ask me for money every month or so until she finally gets a better job. Then her pipes start to leak, and her house gets infested with fleas, and her cat dies. So I start to help out again, until I notice something odd when checking my account balances. She took $300 from me without asking. That's stealing. After everything I've done, she stole $300 from me. I confront her about one of her visits as she's leaving. She says she was going to tell me that day, even though she hadn't, and that she said she was sorry and that she wouldn't do it again. I told her I knew she wasn't going to because I changed all my information. She cried and said that she was sorry that I had to do that, but she understood. It was less than a month before she was asking for money to help finish working on her pipes. I gave it to her. Then my car started breaking down. I'd had it for 12 years, and a friend found a better car for only $1,000 more than the repairs would have been. So, I'd buy it with a pretty modest auto loan to cover what I can't afford. The thing is, after this, I tell my mum that I have less than $100 in my savings, and I can't help out anymore. At all. Now, I had a little less than $500, but honestly, she had no right to know that. So what does she do when I tell her this? Why would you buy a car when you can't afford it? I tell her I could afford it, I just can't afford to give her money anymore. That I needed a new car, and it would have costed me just as much to get repairs on my old car, since I wouldn't have been able to get a loan for that. So this is when it finally sinks in that I'm not going to be giving my mum money anymore. 4 more months pass, and she can no longer afford to pay for home internet, or keep up with her mortgage. I can tell her physical and mental health is starting to deteriorate, and feeling somewhat responsible. Her depression and negativity start seeping into me, and I, for whatever reason, stop taking my antidepressants and start smoking an ungodly amount of marijuana. Does anybody remember that part about my mother demanding that her name be kept on the deed? I sure didn't. Not until I'm ranting to a friend who terrifyingly points out that if my mother defaults on her mortgage, they can use my house as collateral. They can attach what she owes to my property. I start to panic, as in, I have a panic attack that lasts for 4 hours. My friend freaks out and takes me to the ER because I started hyperventilating to the point where I could barely speak. And in case you're wondering, I don't have health insurance. Great. I try talking to my mum multiple times about her taking her name off the deed. I tell her she doesn't need it to be able to live there. I tell her she's shown that she has a history of making bad financial decisions. I finally tell her that if she doesn't, we could lose both houses. But no, she refuses. God knows why, but she refuses again and again and again. Not only refusing, but feeling disrespected and attacked, believing she has a right to this house and that I'm trying to take what little she has left of what my grandmother left behind. Saying that I'm trying to hold power over her or lock her out of my life or something else along those lines. I am in full panic mode now. I can't do anything without her permission if her name is on the deed. I drop 20 pounds in 3 weeks, starting at 130 pounds, and start becoming suicidal. I almost end up in the ER a second time. My significant other and roommate eventually convince me to start taking my antidepressants again, and things get a little better after that. I gain back some of the weight I lost, and the suicidal thoughts become less frequent and less intense. Once I start thinking a little more clearly, I start talking to lawyers about my situation. It takes me 2 weeks and 3 lawyers to find one that says he knows how to help, but that if my mother is going to be uncooperative, it's almost certainly going to court, which will make the price spike dramatically. I can't afford that, so he suggests if the worst were to happen, it would be in my best interest to declare bankruptcy. So I ask my roommate to help me talk to my mum, one last time. I tell my mum that I've been talking to my lawyers. Tell her again that she could lose 2 houses if she didn't remove her name. Tell her that it could result in my bankruptcy. Nope, she will not remove her name. She starts crying in despair and anger. I shouldn't be blaming everything bad in my life on her, she says. There are things that are more important than money, she says. And why do I keep attacking her like this, she asks. So I finally concede. The only thing I would feel comfortable doing that would keep her name on the deed and allow us to keep the house is if she sold her current house for as much as she could muster, and then take over the mortgage I had been paying off. I would take my name off anything connected to her house or this house and walk away. Walk away from a home that I had created after 4 years of work and over $5,000 invested in repairs alone. I don't even know what more to say at this point. Thank God I have people in my life who love me, because after all this is done, my mom will have lost the last person she had. Edit, thank you for all the support and advice. Even if some of it was kind of harsh, it had reinforced the idea that I'm not a terrible daughter for starting to take legal action and cutting her off. I will be taking the advice and talking to my lawyer to see the options given here and will post an update after. It will probably go to legal advice on the Reddit page of that one. Anyway, guys, I hope you enjoyed that story. Sorry if it's a bit, monotone. Don't know if you guys like that or not. Just kind of try and be chill with this one. Hope you guys liked it. Tell me what you thought of it down in the description below, and I hope you have a good day. I'll see you in the next episode. Bye.